Chapter 22, Fighting for the Four Freedoms, World War II, 1941 through 1945, Part 1 and 2. Part 1. The most popular works of art in World War II were paintings of the Four Freedoms by Norman Rockwell. In his State of the Union address before Congress in January 1941, President Roosevelt spoke of a future world order based on essential human freedoms: the freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. During the war, Roosevelt emphasized these freedoms as the Allies' war aims, and he compared them to the Ten Commandments, the Magna Carta, and the Emancipation Proclamation. In his 1943 paintings, Rockwell portrayed ordinary Americans exercising these freedoms: a citizen speaking at a town meeting, members of different religious groups at prayer, a family enjoying a Thanksgiving dinner, and a mother and father standing over a sleeping child. Though Rockwell presented images of small-town American life, the United States changed dramatically in the war. Many post-war trends and social movements had wartime origins. As with World War I, but on a far greater scale, wartime mobilization expanded the size and reach of government and stimulated the economy. Industrial output skyrocketed, and unemployment disappeared as war production finally ended the Depression. Demands for labor drew millions of women into the workforce and lured millions of migrants from rural America to industrial cities of the North and West, permanently changing the nation's social geography. The war also gave the United States a new and lasting international role and reinforced the idea that America's security required the global dominance of American values and power. Government military spending unleashed rapid economic development in the South and West, laying the basis for the modern Sun Belt. The war created a close alliance between big business and a militarized federal government, what President Dwight D. Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. And the war reshaped the boundaries of American nationality. The government recognized the contributions of Americans' ethnic groups as loyal Americans. Black Americans' second-class status attracted national attention, but toleration only went so far. The United States, at war with Japan, forced more than 100,000 Japanese Americans, including citizens, into internment camps. The Four Freedoms thus produced a national unity that obscured divisions within America. Divisions over whether free enterprise or the freedom of a global New Deal would dominate after the war, whether civil rights or white supremacy would define race relations, and whether women would return to traditional roles in the household or enter the labor market. Facing economic crisis in the 1930s, international affairs garnered little public attention, but FDR innovated in foreign and domestic policy. In 1933, trying to encourage trade, he recognized the Soviet Union. Roosevelt also repudiated the right to intervene with military force in the internal affairs of Latin American nations, called the Good Neighbor policy. The United States withdrew troops from Haiti and Nicaragua and accepted Cuba's repeal of the Platt Amendment, which had authorized U.S. intervention in the nation. But Roosevelt, like previous presidents, recognized undemocratic governments like that of Somoza in Nicaragua, Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, and Batista in Cuba. Yet events in Asia and Europe quickly took center stage as international order and the rule of law seemed to disintegrate. In 1931, seeking to expand its power in Asia, Japan invaded Manchuria, a northern province of China. In 1937, it pushed further, committing a massacre of 300,000 Chinese prisoners of war and civilians at Nanjing. In Europe, Hitler, after consolidating his rule within Germany, launched a campaign to dominate the continent. He violated the Versailles Treaty by pursuing a massive rearmament, and in 1936 by sending troops into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone between France and Germany. The failure of Britain, France, and the United States to oppose Hitler's aggression convinced him that these democracies would not resist his aggressions. Benito Mussolini, the father of fascism in Italy, invaded and conquered Ethiopia. When General Francisco Franco in 1936 mounted a rebellion against the democratically elected government of Spain, Hitler and Mussolini sent men and arms to support him. In 1939, Franco won and established another fascist government in Europe. Hitler annexed Austria and Sudetenland, a German area of Czechoslovakia, and soon thereafter invaded and annexed all of that nation too. Roosevelt became more and more alarmed by Hitler's actions in Germany and Europe, but in 1937 called only for a quarantine of aggressors. Roosevelt had little choice but to follow the appeasement policy of France and Britain, who hoped that agreeing to Hitler's demands could prevent war. In 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned from the Munich Conference of 1938, which awarded the Sudetenland to Hitler, promising peace in our time. The threat posed by Germany and Japan seemed distant to most Americans, as Hitler, in fact, had many admirers in America, from those who praised his anti-communism to businessmen who profited from business with the Nazis, such as Henry Ford. Trade also continued with Japan, including shipments of American aircrafts, trucks, and oil, which amounted to 80% of Japan's oil supply. Many Americans now believed American involvement in World War I had been a mistake and benefited only international bankers and arms producers. Pacifism attracted supporters across America from small towns to college campuses. Americans of German and Italian descent also sympathized with fascist governments in their homelands, and Irish Americans remained staunchly anti-British. Isolationism dominated Congress, which in 1935 started enacting a series of neutrality acts banning travel on belligerent ships and arms shipment to warring nations. These were intended to prevent the United States from becoming embroiled in these conflicts by demanding freedom of the seas, just as it had in World War I. Even though the Spanish Civil War saw a democratic republic fighting a fascist dictator, the U.S. and other governments imposed an arms embargo on both sides, effectively allowing Germany and Italy to help Franco overwhelm Spanish government forces. At Munich in 1938, Britain and France capitulated to Hitler's aggression. In 1939, the Soviet Union proposed an international agreement to oppose further German demands for territory, but Britain and France, distrusting Stalin and seeing Germany as a fortress that would check communist power in Europe, declined. Stalin soon signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler, his former enemy. Hitler immediately invaded Poland. Britain and France, allied with Poland, now declared war on Germany. Within a year, the Nazi Blitzkrieg or Lightning War overran Poland and much of Scandinavia, Belgium, and the Netherlands. By June of 1940, German troops occupied Paris. Hitler now dominated Europe and North Africa, and in September 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan formally created a military alliance known as the Axis. For 1 year, Britain, led by a resolute Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, alone resisted Germany, heroically defending its skies from German planes and bombers in the Battle of Britain. The Germans' bombs devastated London and other cities, but the German air campaign was eventually repulsed. Though Roosevelt considered Hitler a direct threat to the United States, most Americans simply wanted to avoid war. After fierce debate, Congress, in 1940, approved plans for military rearmament and agreed to sell arms to Britain on a cash-and-carry basis. Britain would pay cash for arms and transport them in British ships. But Roosevelt, mindful of the presidential election, went no further. Opponents of American intervention mobilized and included such prominent individuals as Henry Ford, Father Coughlin, and Charles A. Lindbergh. In that 1940 election, Roosevelt broke precedent by running for a third presidential term. He faced Republican candidate Wendell Willkie, a Wall Street businessman, lawyer, and amateur politician. Little differentiated the two, as both supported the first peacetime draft law passed in September of 1940 and New Deal social legislation. FDR won the election by a decisive margin. In 1941, the United States became closer to the nations fighting Germany and Japan, and Roosevelt declared America would be a great arsenal of democracy. With Britain close to bankruptcy, Roosevelt had Congress pass the Lend-Lease Act, allowing military aid to countries who promised to repay it after the war. On December 7, 1941, Japanese planes launched a surprise attack from aircraft carriers, bombing the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The assault killed more than 2,000 American soldiers and destroyed much of the base and the U.S. Pacific Fleet, except for crucial U.S. aircraft carriers which helped win critical subsequent victories. Roosevelt, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy, asked Congress to declare war on Japan, which it did nearly unanimously. The next day, Germany, in turn, declared war on America, and the United States had finally entered the largest war in history. Although in retrospect, it seems that America's robust industrial capacity assured its victory over the Axis, success was not sudden. The United States initially experienced a series of military disasters and watched Japan take more territory in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, including Guam, the Philippines, where they captured tens of thousands of U.S. troops, thousands of whom died on the way, to and within prisoner camps, and other Pacific islands. But the tide of the war changed in the late spring of 1942 with American naval victories at Coral Sea and Midway Island. These successes allowed the United States to begin a step-by-step island-hopping campaign to reclaim vital and strategic territories in the Pacific. In November of 1942, British and American forces invaded North Africa, and by May 1943 forced the surrender of German forces there. By this time, the Allies had also gained an advantage in the fight in the Atlantic Ocean against German submarines. While Roosevelt wanted to liberate Europe, most American troops stayed in the Pacific. In July 1943, American and British forces invaded Sicily and began the liberation of Italy, whose government, led by Mussolini, was overthrown by popular revolt. Fighting continued against German forces there throughout 1944. America's fight in Europe began on June 6, 1944. D-Day. On this date, nearly 200,000 American, British, and Canadian soldiers, led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, invaded Normandy in northern France. More than 1 million troops soon followed them, in the largest sea-land operation in history. The Germans resisted but retreated, and by August, Paris had been liberated. The most significant clashes, however, took place on the Eastern Front, where millions of Germans and Soviet troops faced each other in very costly battles, and particularly at Stalingrad, where a German siege ended in a German surrender to the Soviets, a decisive defeat for Hitler. Other Russian victories marked the end of Hitler's advance and the beginning of the end of the Nazi Empire in Eastern Europe. A full 10 million of Germany's nearly 14 million casualties were inflicted on the Eastern Front, and millions of Poles and Russians, many of them civilians, perished. Chapter 22, Part 2. Within the United States, the war transformed the role of the federal government. Roosevelt established new wartime agencies such as the War Production Board, War Manpower Commission, and Office of Price Administration to control labor, distribution, shipping, manufacturing quotas, and fix wages, prices, and rents. The number of federal workers rose from 1 million to 4 million, and unemployment, at a rate of 14% in 1940, virtually disappeared by 1943. The government built housing for war workers and forced civilian companies to produce material for the war effort. Auto plants now made trucks, tanks, and jeeps for the Army. The gross national product more than doubled to $214 billion during the war, and federal wartime spending equaled twice the amount spent in all previous 150 years. The government sold millions in war bonds, hiked taxes, and started taking income tax from Americans' paychecks. By 1945, the number of Americans paying taxes increased. Ties between corporations and the federal government grew much closer during World War II. With business executives taking key positions in federal agencies supervising war industries, Roosevelt gave incentives to increase production. Most federal spending went to the largest companies, which sped up a long-term trend toward economic concentration, and by the war's end, the 200 biggest industrial firms represented nearly half of all corporate assets in the nation. Wartime production was gargantuan in scale and shocking in its intensity, not only making military equipment by the millions, but also lending to inventions such as radar, jet engines, and early computers. The war helped restore the reputation of big business that the Depression had tarnished. Federal funds restored old manufacturing areas and fostered new ones. On the West Coast and places like Southern California, home to steel and aircraft production, and in the South, where out-migration and military-related factories and shipyards shifted employment from agriculture to industry. This raised the South's incomes, but did not end its deep poverty, sparse urbanization, or underdeveloped economy, which still depended on agriculture, extractive industries like mining, lumber, and oil, or manufacturing linked to agriculture such as cotton textiles. Organized labor saw the war as a struggle for freedom that would expand economic and political democracy at home and secure its influence in politics and industry. During the war, unions were part of a three-sided arrangement with government and business that allowed union membership to rise to unprecedented numbers. To win industrial peace and stabilize war production, the federal government forced resistant employers to recognize unions. In turn, union leaders promised not to strike and recognized employers' right to managerial prerogatives and fair profits. By the war's end, unions were entrenched in many economic sectors, and nearly 15 million workers, a third of the non-farm labor workforce, were union members, the highest proportion in U.S. history. But labor was a less powerful partner in the war than business or government. The New Deal's decline continued during the war, and Congress became thoroughly dominated by a conservative alliance between Republicans and Southern Democrats, who retained Social Security but ended programs allegedly controlled by leftists, such as the CCC and WPA. Many workers protested demanding wartime conditions and the freeze on wages imposed by the government, even while corporate profits soared. World War II came to be remembered as the Good War, in which the nation united behind noble aims. But all wars need mobilization of public opinion, and freedom was a prominent theme in efforts to sell the war. Roosevelt believed the four freedoms represented essential American values that could be universalized across the globe. Freedom from fear meant a desire not only for peace, but for long-term security in a chaotic world. The importance of freedom of speech and religion seemed self-evident, but their prominence emphasized the new significance of First Amendment protections of free expression. During the war, the Supreme Court judges, contrasting American constitutional liberty with Nazi tyranny, upheld the rights of religious minorities to refuse to salute the American flag in public schools, in contrast to the coercive patriotism of World War I. Freedom from want seemed the most ambiguous of the four freedoms. Though FDR used it to refer to eliminating barriers to trade, he soon linked this freedom to guaranteeing a standard of living for American workers and farmers by preventing a return of the Depression. FDR argued this would bring real freedom for the common man. The Office of War Information, established in 1942 to foster public support for the war, shows how political divisions created by the New Deal shaped efforts to promote the four freedoms. Liberal staff at the OWI tried to portray the war as a people's fight for freedom against fascism and tyranny, giving it an ideological meaning while trying to avoid nationalist hysteria. Images of America standing for liberty in a world overrun by tyranny and slavery recalled the American Revolution and emancipation during the Civil War, but critics charged that FDR was promoting freedoms as realized in New Deal social programs, not just American values. Congress cut most of its funding. With the OWI's demise, mobilizing public opinion fell to private advertising firms that urged Americans to buy war bonds and take other patriotic actions. These advertising firms, which sold manufactured goods for big business, worked with the National Association of Manufacturers and other companies to suggest that Roosevelt had missed a fifth freedom, free enterprise. Their message about the benefits of capitalism was reinforced by a new explosion of mass consumer goods that became available during the war, despite rationing. Advocates of free enterprise told Americans to expect post-war abundance if government controls over the economy were removed. War mobilization sparked an unprecedented growth in women's employment to fill industrial jobs left by men. Government and private ads celebrated the independent woman worker with images like Rosie the Riveter, the female industrial laborer painted by Norman Rockwell as a muscle-bound and self-reliant woman. With 15 million men in the military, women in 1944 were one-third of the civilian workforce, and 350,000 women served in auxiliary military units. Women filled industrial, professional, and government jobs previously barred to them, such as aircraft manufacturing and shipbuilding, and they forced some unions like the United Auto Workers to confront issues like equal pay for equal work, maternity leave, and childcare. Many women who had a taste of freedom working men's jobs for male wages hoped to remain in the workforce after the war. Yet government, employers, and unions saw women's work as only a temporary wartime necessity. Though ads told women working in factories that they were fighting for freedom, their language promoted victory, not women's rights or independence. After the war, most women war workers, especially those in high-paying industrial positions, lost their jobs to men. Indeed, war ads informed Americans that their work would help secure the American way of life. After the war, traditional families, with the women at home and men at work, enjoying household appliances and consumer goods.